like I said. So rook b1 to prepare b4. And then this idea of knight h3, knight f4, and knight d5, or knight f4 and d3 and b4. But you want to play knight d5 to kind of support this knight. So, and then from d5 you can kind of go to e3, and then from e3 you can go to c2, and from c2 then you can prepare b4 even further. So, okay. So yeah, a3 is to be recommended, I think. And then, yeah, so black just develops normally. For example, it plays knight f6, b1, castle. You play b4. Oops, you play b4, and this should be good. And then your idea is you just want to play knight f3, d3, castle, and you have a standard queenside attack. This is very typical for the English opening. So, let me see. Okay, so I'll show a game that kind of illustrates what happens in these positions. So it won't be from this line, but it'll kind of transpose. So so bishop g2, bishop g7. So the more common move other than a3 is knight f3, but you'll see it kind of gets to the same thing. So e6, castle, knight g7, d3, castle, bishop d2. So bishop d2 to defend this, so you can play rook b1, a3, and f4, or a3 and b4. So b6, a3, d5, rook b1, bishop b7. Oops. Okay. So bishop b7, cd5, e5, and b4. Okay. Black is doing nothing wrong. I'm just saying that white gets easy play. Still have to prove it though. But no, black's doing nothing wrong. Okay. So this looks a little awkward. But so the idea is like a take, d4, knight a4, knight d5, then you play b5, knight ce7, queen b3. And so here basically you're getting your rooks to c1, and this pawn on b5 is doing a good job of kind of this one pawn is doing a good job of stopping these two pawns, and so we have a pawn advantage on the king side. And this pawn on d4 will always be a source of concern for black because his bishop's kind of just biting on the granite on this pawn on d4. So white has a little bit more. Black has more space in the center, but white has more mobility because his queen is well placed, and it's hard for black to find a place for his queen without being subject to potential attacks. So, so white might try to go like knight g5 to e4, and maybe knight d2 to c4. Try to go to d6, all sorts of stuff. So instead of this, black tried c4, which didn't work out as well because after b5, knight has to move now, so knight a5, and now knight a4. So the point is he wants to try to take on c5 and play knight c5. And now black plays rook c8. And now the move that allows white to claim a significant edge here is again something you wouldn't think, but it's d4. So you give black this protected passed pawn on c4, but uh, the negatives for black is that this bishop is now blocked up because this d5 pawn isn't going anywhere. This d4 pawn is now fighting for control of this square as well as this square. And also this bishop is now no longer a threat because it's blocked by this pawn. So now all of white's pieces are kind of coming into the game. So knight b3, bishop b4, oops, bishop b4, and white is better here. So this is one of the typical ideas in this b4, is kind of to try to provoke some sort of disharmony among the black's pieces on the queen side. So this is a good way to handle the kind of symmetrical Englishes that can arise. So okay, now let's look finally at the main thing that you'll probably face when playing the English, which is some sort of Sicilian. So c4, e5. Okay, so these go into Sicilian reverse positions, so called because after e4, c5, it's like a Sicilian but reversed. So there's a lot of ways to play these positions. You can play an immediate g3 here, to kind of avoid some of the stuff, or you can just play knight c3 first. So knight c3 is probably the more common choice. Okay, so oftentimes you'll end up playing a dragon reverse. So knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, g3, and now d5, cd5, knight d5, bishop g2. Okay, so this is what's known as a dragon reversed, because white's playing the dragon and black's playing an e4 opening basically, but the colors are reversed. So some of the same tactics still work. So for example, if black tries something like bishop e6, then castle, then bishop c5, then knight takes e5 is strong. Because of takes, then d4. And white's pieces are just more harmonious. That's a typical little trap. So yeah, playing this immediate d5 means often that black will not be able to castle queenside, which is often what happens in these dragon positions. Black castles queenside and then tries to play like h4 or h5, or in this case h5, h4. But since that's no good, black usually has to try to play something else. So oftentimes black will develop his bishop first on f8. So like bishop b4, for example, is somewhat popular. So now white can either play bishop g2 and allow this possibility of bishop takes c3, or play knight d5. Yeah, so one reason to play g3 is to avoid the the bishop e4 stuff immediately, right? So yeah, and another point is that even here, black can play bishop b4 immediately. And this is actually a tricky move to meet. It looks kind of silly, but it's tricky. So black basically just wants to take here and play knight f6, castle, d6, knight b7, b6, bishop b7. And these pawns are kind of stuck. So knight d5 here is interesting, and it kind of transposes into what we saw earlier. But but yeah, g3 is a way to avoid all this stuff. So so you have to be on the lookout for quick d4s. So for example, like after knight f6, bishop g2, if black tries to play c6 to kind of like build a huge pawn center, you have to be ready to play d4 quickly. So d4, take, d5, and knight f3 is better for white. Um, but yeah, if you kind of just like go with your plan in these positions and like, so say you just so c6, say you just played I don't know, d3 or something, and then allowed d5. This could easily get worse for white. So you always want to make sure you're kind of contesting for the center squares, even if it means getting your queen out early. But of course, when black plays c6, it means his knight can't come to c6, so you don't have to worry about d4. You don't have to worry about this queen being harassed too much. But yeah, so early d4s are often strong antidotes against when black plays a lot of pawn moves in the opening. So when black's playing piece moves, you can kind of counter it with piece moves. But when black plays a lot of pawn moves, it's often a good idea to play pawn moves. Another example is like if you play c4, e5, knight c3, f5. A good move here is also d4 right away. Yeah, a little bit, a little bit. And this is actually good for white. So even if take, knight c6, queen e3, this is actually very good for white because it's kind of awkward for black to meet this threat, this check, and he's just going to develop knight f3, bishop d2, oops, bishop d2, queenside castle, and white has a good game. So again, when black makes a lot of pawn moves, oftentimes a quick d4 is the solution. So okay, so let's see how this works. So g3, g6, and again pawn moves. So d4. So if takes knight f6, this should be better for white. Again, this queen e3 idea. Bishop e7, knight d5, and d6. This is a key move. So that after knight h3, this bishop is going to take a long time to get out. Long time to get out. So anyway, instead of all this, black played d6 simply and went into this endgame. So take, oops, take. Okay. So this is actually slightly better for white. Slightly better for white. So knight c3, c6, keeping him out of those two squares. And now the most testing idea here is to play f4 immediately. So if pawn takes pawn, this actually almost loses by force. Bishop takes f4, and now this king is kind of stuck. This bishop overlooks c7. Queenside castle check is coming. And stuff like knight f3, knight e5, and knight f3, knight g5, and bishop e5 are all coming. So this is actually almost completely lost for black. So he can't really take. So bishop e6 instead. Obviously, this just looks bad for white. All these pawns are not very good. but simple knight f3.